I hope you enjoy this Western adventure short story. Click subscribe to get a brand new full-length audiobook each week, and don't forget to hit the Western Action playlist for hours of Wild West action. Chapter 1. The boxcar of barbed wire was unhooked from the freight train and shoved onto the railroad siding at Sweet Home at 6 o'clock in the morning. Kit Barnett, drummer working for the American Barbed Wire Manufacturing Company of Chicago, Illinois, arrived in Sweet Home on the 4 o'clock train of the same day. His job was to sell the carload of barbed wire, and 100 more like it, if he could. In Chicago, they said Kit Barnett could sell anything, from soap to hardware, and this was true. But selling soap to grocery stores and iron stoves galvanized buckets to hardware dealers had eventually lost their appeal. He lived in the age of the empire builders, when fortunes were being made in railroads, in grain, in real estate, in mines and speculations. And there was nothing of the empire builder in him. Western country was a new empire opening up. To a new country, he was bringing a brand new product, barbed wire. He proposed to fence the West, and to get rich while he was doing it. When he got off the train at Sweet Home, it was the first time he had ever set foot on soil west of the Mississippi River. He was a big city man. His first glance told him that Sweet Home was not like the big city. The difference was not a matter of size. Sweet Home was a dot on the prairie with blue mountains off on the horizon, a town of maybe 200 inhabitants. Chicago was a mighty city on the lakefront with hundreds of thousands of residents, and growing bigger every year. There was no comparison between the sizes of the two places, but the big difference between Chicago and Sweet Home was in the people who lived in each place. People who lived in Chicago were always in a hurry. In Sweet Home, an air of leisure was obvious. Every resident of the town was down at the depot to watch the train come in. They had time for things like this in Sweet Home. They had time to be friendly, too. As he picked up his bags and started toward the depot, men lounging on the M platform nodded to him. Nobody nodded to a stranger in Chicago. There were other points of difference, too. You saw many white-faced men in Chicago, men who rarely saw the sun. These men here had sun-brown faces. They wore big hats and flannel shirts and high-heeled boots. And they carried guns. A holstered pistol hung easily on the hip of almost every man on the platform. The guns, and the easy, familiar way they were worn, surprised Barnett. People in Chicago didn't carry guns. He had only fired a gun once in his life, a little double-action .32 caliber pistol in which pulling the trigger lifted the hammer and fired the weapon. It was a toy, really. But the guns these men carried weren't toys. Why did they carry them, he wondered. They seemed to be such friendly people that guns were unnecessary. A friendly station agent accepted Barnett's credentials and showed him his car of barbed wire sitting on the railroad siding. "We plan to give a demonstration of the uses of barbed wire," Barnett explained. "It's a great invention. The only sure, safe way a rancher can control his stock, keep them within his own range, and prevent straying." The station agent was thoughtful. "I've heard of barbed wire," he said. "Has any of it been brought in here yet?" "No, not yet. I heard that one big rancher has ordered a couple of carloads of it, but the wire hasn't been delivered yet. You're the first man to bring barbed wire to Sweet Home." Again, the thoughtful note sounded in his voice, but if he had any reservations, he did not express them. He showed Barnett where the salesman could find lodgings. "Ain't no hotel in Sweet Home. You'll have to stay at May Pearson's rooming house. But she'll take mighty good care of you." She did take good care of him, fluttering in and out of his room like an old hen that has suddenly discovered a missing chick. She adjusted the windows so he would have the maximum of air, and the shades so he would have the minimum of sunlight. She dusted out the immense china wash bowl and brought him a tea kettle full of hot water so he could shave, puffing up the rickety back stairs with the tea kettle in her hands. "Anything else you'd like to be comfortable, Mister? I'm just going to call you Kit. Ain't nobody around this country calls anybody Mister unless they're mad." Drying chapped hands on a faded blue apron, she peeped timidly at him over gold-rimmed glasses. "That is, if you don't mind," she finished. "Glad to have you call me Kit," he answered, grinning. Blue apron fluttering, she went out of his room, stopping in the doorway long enough to tell him for the 5th time that if there was anything he wanted to be sure to ask for it. What service, Barnett thought. No, it wasn't service. Service was what you got in the big hotels in Chicago. Service was a grinning black porter, scraping and bowing for a quarter tip. Service was a room clerk in a high collar, rapping sharply on the bell and saying, "Front boy, show Mr. Barnett to the best room in the house." Service was front, service was show, service was the servility of a lackey looking for a tip. This was something different. May Pearson had never heard the word. She didn't go to all the trouble to bring him hot water just to put up a front. She did it to show her friendly interest in him. She did it for the same reason that the booted, spurred, and holstered men lounging on the station platform had smilingly spoken to him. This was the courtesy of the West, the smiling, easy, interested friendliness of a big new country. It was something new in Kit Barnett's life, something he was beginning to like. When he finished shaving, he went down to the freight siding to inspect the car of barbed wire and to make preparations for hiring a crew of men to unload it. He also had to rent a shed of some kind for storage space until the wire was sold. Across the street, directly in front of the boxcar, was a saloon. 3 horses were tied in front of it, and a spurred, booted, holstered cowboy was lounging in front. As soon as the cowboy saw Barnett inspecting the car, he turned his head into the saloon and called out, "Here he is now." Barnett heard the words clearly. 2 men came out of the saloon and joined the cowboy. The 3 walked across the street, moving with purposeful strides. The man in front was tall. He wore an expensive white hat and a gray flannel shirt. A heavy pearl-handled revolver hung easily at his hip. "Howdy," the tall man said to Barnett. "You the drummer that's selling this barbed wire?" There was arrogance on the tall man's face, arrogance in the twist of his hawk nose, arrogance in his expressionless gray eyes, arrogance in the tones of his voice. The tones of arrogance raised prickles of hair along Barnett's back. In Chicago, men were arrogant. Out here, arrogance was out of place. "I am," he answered crisply. "What can I do for you?" "You can hitch this car onto the next train that comes through here and get it out of the country," the answer came. For a second, Barnett thought he hadn't heard correctly. He couldn't believe he had heard such words. In this friendly little town, in this friendly Western country, he was being told to get out of town. His opinion of the West underwent a swift revision. Men were friendly out West all right, but all of them weren't. Some of them were arrogant, some of them were tough, some of them were hard. And he suddenly saw the reason why so many of the men wore guns. There wasn't much law out here, maybe there wasn't any law. In a country where there wasn't much law, men had to wear guns to protect themselves from people like this tall man with the arrogance on his face and in his voice. "What did you say?" Barnett asked. "I said, to take your wire and get to hell out of here with it." "May I ask why?" Barnett answered. The tall man hesitated. Beside him, the 2 cowboys stood silent and impassive. The butts of their holstered guns were worn smooth from much handling. "Why?" Barnett repeated. It might be, the tall man answered. It might be because I say so. Because I order it, it must be done. I am the master here. You are nobody, you are nothing. You must do what I say. And who, Barnett questioned, are you? That might not be any of your business, the tall man said. And it might be too, Barnett hotly answered. Am I to understand you're ordering me out of town? The tall man nodded slowly. I guess you about hit the nail on the head that time. Not that I've got anything against you personally, but we don't want any barbed wire around here yet. Hot wind blew along the railroad tracks from the west. The sun, low in the western sky, threw long shadows over the little town of Sweet Home. A horse clip-clopped along the tracks. The four men stood in the shade at the end of the boxcar. Across the street in the saloons and in front of the stores, Barnett was aware that men were watching them. Why don't you want it around here yet? Barnett questioned. That, the tall man answered, is something else that's none of your business. You can go to hell, Barnett said. I came out here to sell barbed wire, and I'm going to sell it, and neither you nor anybody like you is going to run me out of town. Even as he spoke, he wondered what was going to happen next. The tall man glanced at the cowboy on his right and nodded. The cowboy pulled a gun. He spoke without taking his eyes off Barnett. You want me to gut shoot him? He asked. Barnett was dumbfounded at the calm, methodical way they proposed murder. The tall man thought about what his gunman had asked. Out of the corners of his eyes, he was aware of the watchers on the street. If the watchers had not been there, his answer might have been different. Slowly, he shook his head. The gun had been pulled so quickly that Barnett had not had time to catch his breath. 1 second, he was telling a man to go to hell. The next second, he was looking down the muzzle of a gun. By the time the third second had passed, even before the tall man had shook his head, he knew they were trying to bluff him. Bluffing was something he understood, and he determined to hold his ground. I know a bluff when I see one, he said. And I'm going to say again what I said before, you can go to hell. When I get out of this country, it will be because I want to go, and not because I'm ordered to leave. I hope you understand me quite clearly. I'm here to sell this car load of barbed wire, and I'm going to stay until it's sold. And when this one is gone, I'll order another, and then another. The cowboy with the gun took 2 quick steps forward. He lifted the pistol. Barnett saw it coming. He tried to dodge. The pistol smashed across the side of his head with stunning force. He stumbled backward, stars exploding in front of his eyes. He had read about pistol whipping. Now he knew what the words meant. He stumbled and sat down heavily as the strength went out of his legs. Dazed and stunned, he was vaguely aware of 2 sounds. One was the tall man saying, "Maybe that will convince you we mean what we say." The second sound was the swift hoofbeats of a galloping horse running down the street beside the railroad. The horse slid to a halt beside them. The rider looked at the 4 men beside the boxcar. A pistol flashed. "Put that gun down, you rat, before I let daylight through you," the rider said. Not until he heard her voice did Barnett realize the rider was a woman. "Drop that gun," she repeated. The pistol in her hand covered the cowboy who had struck Barnett. His face darkened. He didn't like it a little bit, but he let the pistol slide to the cinders in the railroad track. The tall man looked reproachfully at the girl on the horse. "Now, Nancy," he said. "Miss Nancy to you, Bart Lucas," she answered. "And while you're about it, you and the other killer of yours pull your guns and drop them on the ground." The tall man reddened. All along the street, eyes were watching him. He didn't like the idea of a girl forcing him to put down his gun. He shook his head. The bullet from the girl's gun knocked his beautiful hat 15 feet. "When I tell you to drop your guns, I mean it," she said. "Now drop them. And be quick about it." Amazed to the bottom of his soul, Barnett saw the two men slowly pull their guns from their holsters and let them slide to the ground. They didn't want to do it, not a little bit. The story of how a girl had made them take off their hardware would be told and retold over the entire country to their bitter discredit. They would have liked to do anything except drop their guns, but they didn't have any choice. They couldn't draw on a woman. They couldn't shoot this girl on the horse. 100 enraged men would be hungering for their blood if they did that. On the other hand, they couldn't refuse to obey her orders. The bullet that had knocked off Bart Lucas's hat had not only convinced them that she meant what she said, but had proved that she could shoot straight. The guns crunched as they were dropped into the cinders. Barnett got slowly to his feet. He backed against the boxcar and leaned against it while a little strength came back to his legs. He was burning with anger. The unfair pistol whipping had enraged him as he had never been enraged before. But over and above his rage was amazement at this girl. Who was she? Why had she pulled a gun on the three men? Why had she rescued him? For that matter, why had they ordered him to leave the country and take his barbed wire with him? "You?" The girl's blue eyes were fixed on him. "You there? Are you able to talk?" "I think so, ma'am," he answered. "Are you the man who brought this barbed wire in here?" Barnett took his time about answering this question. Bart Lucas had asked him the same question. Then the fireworks had started. Now this girl was putting the same query to him. "Speak up," she said impatiently. "I heard there was a man in town with a carload of barbed wire that he wanted to sell. Are you the man?" "Why do you want to know?" he countered. "Because I want to buy it," she answered. Bart Lucas stiffened when she spoke. "You mean you're going to buy this wire?" the tall rancher questioned. "That's right," she answered. Anger reddened his face as she spoke. "I'm going to use it to fence part of Silver Springs," she added. "Our part of the springs?" Barnett had no idea of what she was talking about, but Lucas seemed to understand. He turned quickly to the salesman. "I'll take delivery on this carload of barbed wire tomorrow," he said. "What?" Barnett gasped. "I've bought your barbed wire," the rancher repeated. "I'll take delivery on it tomorrow. Here's the down payment to bind the bargain." Pulling a thick wallet out of his inside coat pocket, he began counting out $20 bills. The girl on horseback stared in consternation at the scene. "What are you doing?" she questioned. Lucas glanced up. "Paying for this barbed wire," he answered. Again, the note of arrogant triumph was in his voice. "Put that money down," the girl said. "I've already bought the wire." She sounded scared, frightened. "First come, first served, Miss Nancy," Lucas icily said. "It happens. I've already made a deal to buy this barbed wire. And I'm buying it." He turned to Barnett, shoved a stack of bills toward the salesman. "Here's 500. I'll pay the balance when I take delivery tomorrow." The salesman looked at the wad of bills Lucas was holding toward him. "Take your $500 and stuff it," he said. "I'd advise you to reconsider," the rancher glared at him. "5 minutes ago you were ordering me out of town," the salesman explained. "You didn't want the wire then. But the minute somebody else turns up and wants to buy, you jump into the market up to your neck. It won't work, Lucas. It won't work. Your barbed wire is for sale, ain't it?" "It's for sale," Barnett answered. "And I'm selling it to the lady on the horse." The frustrated arrogance on the rancher's face was balm to Barnett's soul. The salesman did not know why this girl and this rancher were both trying to buy his barbed wire, but he could see one thing quite clearly. A fight was going on. He and his barbed wire had landed right in the middle of it. He didn't know who was in the right in this fight, but he knew whose side he was on. "I'm selling to the lady on the horse," he repeated. "She made the first offer to buy, and she gets the merchandise. Is that clear, or shall I draw you a picture?" "It's clear enough, all right," Lucas answered. All color had gone out of his face. Barnett saw the rancher's gaze go from him to the guns on the ground, then to the gun in the girl's hand, then to the watchers along the street. Bart Lucas didn't like the situation. He didn't like it, even a little bit. "Sorry," Barnett said bluntly. "I would have sold this wire to you or to anyone else who wanted to buy it." "You're not half as sorry as you're going to be," the rancher answered. He looked at the girl. "Mind if we pick up our guns?" he said. "Just leave them lay," the girl answered. "And get moving, you three. Your business is all finished here." All right, the rancher answered. He walked off the railroad tracks and across the street. His 2 men followed him. All 3 mounted horses tied in front of the saloon and spurred out of town. The girl slid from her horse. "Thanks, friend," she said huskily. "I was afraid he had got in ahead of me." "My name is Kit," the salesman answered. "Kit Barnett. You don't need to thank me. But I would appreciate it if you would tell me what this is all about." She looked appraising Ly at him, her glance taking in his expensive clothes, his white shirt, his smooth hands, and his clean fingernails. All of these things spelled Eastern dude to her. She was a Western woman. She had little faith in anything that came out of the East, especially if it had white hands and wore tailored clothes. "My name is Nancy Jones," she said. "I guess maybe you wouldn't understand it, Kit, but there's a series of water holes known as Silver Springs about 40 miles north of here. The cattle from one big ranch and from 4 little ranches use these springs for water. Bart Lucas owns the big ranch. My father owns one of the little spreads. The springs are on land that is actually open for settlement, but except for the water, it isn't worth settling. In the past, we've always considered the springs as common property. Since there was no way to fence them, we had to consider them as belonging to all of us. Now we've heard about this new stuff they called barbed wire. And Bart Lucas has heard about it. We have learned he has ordered 2 carloads of it to fence the springs." "I see," Barnett said slowly. "And if he fences the springs, your cattle won't be able to water there. You'll go bust," Nancy supplied. "That's exactly it. However, Lucas hasn't been able to get delivery on the wire he has ordered. And when I brought in a carload of wire, he was afraid you would buy it and use it to fence part of the springs," Barnett said. "That was why he wanted me and my wire out of the country to keep you from getting it." He explained what had happened before she arrived. "That's the answer, all right," the girl said. "I learned only this morning that a car of wire had been put on the siding here at Sweet Home. At first, I thought it was the wire that Lucas had ordered. Then I learned it wasn't his wire. So I came to see about it." "And you got here just in time to buy the whole lot," Barnett said, grinning. "Yes," she answered. He was aware that she was studying him thoughtfully. "I've sold a lot of merchandise in my life," he said. "But this is the first time I ever had people fighting to buy from me. When can you take delivery on the wire?" "I can have 6 men and 4 wagons and teams here by sunup tomorrow morning," Nancy answered promptly. "There's only one thing." A wistful note crept into her voice. With the coming of that note, a subtle change showed on her face. When she had ridden up, she had been a hard-headed, aggressive young woman, riding hell for leather for what she wanted. Now, somehow, this aggressive young woman was gone. In her place was a wistful little girl. Kit had once seen a street waif looking through the plate glass window of a huge Chicago store at the most beautiful doll in the world. She was barefooted. Her little skirt was ragged and torn. Her hair had a single greasy ribbon in it. She wanted that doll in the store window more than anything else on earth, but she couldn't buy it, not in 1,000 years. Something about this tan-faced Western woman reminded him of that little girl in Chicago. When she said, "There's only one thing," she looked like that little street waif. "What's that?" he questioned. We can't pay you for it," she answered. Barnett gulped. He had sold the wire to this girl, and now she was telling him she couldn't pay for it. He knew his company. They wanted cash on the line, cash on delivery. They were willing to extend a minimum amount of short-term credit to well-established local stores with a good financial rating, but extending credit to individuals was not their policy. Al Boggs, the credit manager, would die of apoplexy at the very thought. His face revealed what he was thinking. "We'll be glad to give you notes," Nancy quickly said. "We'll pay all right, but we just can't pay now." How long would the notes run before payment?" he asked, and kicked himself for asking. "A year," the girl answered. "We might be able to pay them a little before a year if we're lucky." Again, she reminded him of the little girl looking through the plate glass window at the doll she could never hope to own. Barnett had gone into the big store that day. He had taken the little barefooted girl with him, taken her past all the decorated floor walkers, past the supercilious clerks, and he had bought the doll for her. The last he had seen of her, she had been going down State Street with the doll tightly clutched in both arms, a little girl who thought Chicago was heaven. He knew he oughtn't to do it. He knew he was a sucker. He called himself bad names under his breath, but he knew what he was going to do. "I'll take your notes, Miss Jones," he said. Her eyes glinted like stars in the summer sky. "Thank you, Kit," she said. For a second, he thought she was going to kiss him. Or perhaps he hoped she was. But she didn't kiss him. She shook hands with him instead, then swung lithely into the saddle. "I'll have the men and the teams here in the morning," she said. "And thank you again." "Don't mention it," he said. "Boggs can go to hell," he muttered, watching her ride down the street. In spite of his defiance, he knew that Boggs would deduct the price of 1 carload of barbed wire from his salary and commissions. He picked up the 3 guns that had been left lying in the railroad tracks, stuck them into his coat pockets. The thought occurred to him that maybe the credit manager would deduct the value of the guns from the price of the barbed wire if he sent the weapons into the company. He was kidding himself, and he knew it. The American Barbed Wire Manufacturing Company had no use for weapons. That night, he dreamed he had fenced the whole Western territories with barbed wire and had accepted worthless promissory notes for every foot of the fencing. He awakened in a cold sweat with the imaginary specter of the irate Boggs deducting millions of dollars from his salary. "You gave the wire away," Boggs was yelling in his dream. "You deliberately defrauded the company. And you'll have to make good on every penny of it, even if you work for nothing for the next 10 years. In cold reality, Kit knew there was not much fantasy about this dream. A carload of barbed wire ran into thousands of dollars. If Nancy and the 4 ranchers she represented didn't pay off, he would certainly be working for nothing for months to come. "Why do I have to be such a damn sucker?" he groaned. "A red mouth, and blue eyes and a pair of pretty legs, and I jump in up to my chin. Well, maybe she won't come for the wire in the morning." Only he wanted her come for the wire. But what if she doesn't pay her notes, he thought. It was a jarring thought. In combination with his dream, it drove sleep out of his mind. He got up and sat by the window. A cool night breeze was blowing down from the far-off mountains. A bright moon made the empty street outside his window almost as light as day. He struck a match and looked at his watch. It was also 4 o'clock. Dawn was not far off. Sweet Home was sound asleep. Far off in the night, a coyote howled. He sat by the window and let the restful quietness of the western night seep into his soul. Then a new sound came to his ears, the creak and jolt of a heavily loaded wagon passing under his window. The moonlight revealed the driver hunched up on his seat, the 2 horses straining at the heavy load. The wagon was almost out of sight before he realized it was loaded with spools of bright new barbed wire. Barbed wire. Where would anyone find barbed wire in Sweet Home? Except from his carload. In the dark room, he suddenly began hunting for his clothes. He pulled on his socks and boots, slid into his pants, hastily pulled on his coat. Then he remembered the 3 guns lying on the dresser. He found one of them, slipped it into his coat pocket. He went quietly out the front door of May Pearson's rooming house. Keeping in the shadows, he walked swiftly down to the railroad. The car on the siding was plainly visible. A wagon was drawn up beside the open door, loading. Another wagon was waiting to load. 2 men inside the car were handing spools of barbed wire out to 2 other men standing in the bed of the wagon, drawn up beside the open door of the car. Barnett watched the men work, then began to grin. "I'll say something for Nancy Jones," he thought. "She really gets things moving, but fast." She hadn't waited until daylight to come for the wire. The pressure to get at least part of the disputed springs fenced was too great to waste an hour. He stepped out of the shadows and started across the street toward the boxcar standing on the siding. He did not know there was anyone behind him until he felt the gun jammed into his back and heard the voice rasp in his ear. "Get those hands up, drummer, and be fast about it." He lifted his hands and turned his head. He knew the man standing there. The last time he had seen that thin face had been with Bart Lucas. "Okay," he said, "but take it easy. I've got about $100 on me. You can have it without any argument." "I'm not interested in your money," the gunman answered. "No. Then what do you want?" "I want you to walk down the street ahead of me. I'll tell you where to go. And don't try to put your hands down, or I'll blow a hole in your backbone. Move, drummer, move." Barnett glanced at the men unloading the boxcar. If they saw him, they gave no sign. Anyhow, they didn't know him. He started walking. "Around the Comer and down the side street," the gunman said. Barnett obeyed his instructions. He was ordered to enter the side door of a saloon. He found himself in a small back room with 2 men in it. One of the men was Bart Lucas. The other was his second gunman. The rancher glanced up. His face was all arrogance now, all successful egotism. He grinned. "Hello, drummer," he said. "What do you want?" Barnett demanded. The arrogant grin widened. "What do I want? Oh, nothing much. I just want to pay you for the barbed wire my men are taking, so everything will be legal and you can't raise a squawk and say I stole it." "Your men?" Barnett gasped. Until this moment, he had thought that the men removing the wire from the car were employed by Nancy Jones. "Are those your men out there?" Lucas nodded. "Naturally," he drawled. "Did you think they were working for somebody else?" "Well, Lucas enjoyed his confusion. He sucked every drop of satisfaction out of the situation, then got down to business. "How much for the carload of wire, drummer?" he asked. $18,300, Kit Barnett answered. Lucas didn't bat an eye. "The price plus freight charges is $4,200. I've recently had occasion to get prices on wire in carload lots. You can't jack up the price on me, drummer, hoping that maybe I won't be able to pay. Here's your money." He shoved a stack of bills across the table where he was sitting. Barnett looked at the money and said nothing. His mind was working lightning fast. He saw the spot he was in. Lucas was taking the wire. This was larceny, robbery, theft, whatever you wanted to call it. To escape the charge of stealing the wire, Lucas was paying for it. Thus Barnett could not say the wire was stolen. Lucas could produce witnesses, and the two gunmen were certainly witnesses, to prove he had paid cash for it. "The wire is already sold," Barnett said. "You're a little late in trying to buy it. I'll be glad to ship you as much as you want, but this load is already sold. Miss Jones and her partners are the legal owners of that wire. You'll have to make your proposition to them." Lucas listened and grinned. "Not tonight," he said. "Not tonight, drummer. You own that wire so far as I'm concerned, and I'm buying it from you. Here's your money." He shoved the stack of bills a little closer to Barnett. "The wire is not for sale," the drummer said. "That's all there is to it. The wire is sold. Consequently, it's not for sale." He turned, started to walk out of the back room. He was running a bluff, or trying to, even though he knew before he tried it that they would never let him walk out of there like this. He quickly discovered he was right. The gun, which had momentarily lessened its pressure on his back, was instantly jammed against his spine. "You going somewhere?" Lucas drawled. Barnett flushed. "I guess not," he answered. "Here's your money," the rancher said for the third time. "Take it and you can go." Barnett's temper was at the boiling point. These cowhands weren't going to work a deal like this on him. Lucas was bluffing. There was no way he could buy the wire by force. "No," Barnett said. Lucas looked at him. "I won't sell that wire to you," Barnett continued. "The fact that your men are taking possession of it remains what it was when they started. Plain, simple robbery. That's all there is to it, and all there is going to be. I don't know what kind of law you have around here, but you are certainly going to face charges of stealing. Now, how do you like that?" The back room was silent. Behind him, Barnett could hear the gunman breathing heavily. Lucas said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "I have two witnesses who will swear I paid you," he said. "And I'll go into court and call them liars," Barnett answered. A thin grin was on the rancher's face. "No, you won't," he said. "Why won't I?" "Because you'll be dead," Lucas said. His words were hard, jarring sounds in the silence of the room. They jarred Kit Barnett. He looked closely at Lucas, trying to see if the rancher meant what he said. His shock grew when he realized that Lucas meant every word of it. For the first time, Barnett fully realized how much was at stake here. He had thought that he might lose some money if Nancy Jones and the little ranchers she represented did not pay their notes. That would hurt, but after all, money was only something to spend. You could always make more money. Now he realized that more than money was at stake, a damned sight more. His life. If you lost your life, there wasn't anything you could do about it, not ever. "You'll just be found dead," Lucas continued. "You won't have a dime on you. I'll have two witnesses who will swear I paid you and that you walked out of here with the money in your possession. The motive for the killing? Robbery. You were carrying a lot of money. You were waylaid and robbed. That will be all there is to it." He had everything all thought out down to the last detail. "You really mean it?" Barnett whispered. It was a statement, not a question. "You can bet your last dollar I mean it," the rancher answered. "If we really have to get tough, we can get awful tough. Now, drummer, for the fourth and last time, I'm offering you your money. Are you going to take it?" Barnett thought for a second. He either took the money or got killed. It was either or else. Reaching forward, he picked up the stack of bills from the top of the table. "Okay, drummer," Lucas drawled. "You can go now. And if I were in your shoes, I'd keep right on going." When Kit Barnett stepped outside the back door of the saloon, dawn was beginning to appear in the eastern sky. Down the street and out on the railroad siding, he could hear voices raised in argument. He walked in that direction. The men had stopped unloading the barbed wire. 3 empty wagons were lined up beside the tracks. 8 or 10 men were gathered in a knot around the first wagon. He walked up to the group. The men stopped arguing, turned toward him. "There's Kit now," he heard Nancy say. "He'll explain mighty fast who owns this wire." She came quickly toward him. "Kit," her voice was a flat, tight sound. "These men are working for Bart Lucas. They've already unloaded part of the barbed wire. They say he owns the wire." "They're right," Barnett answered dully. In the half-light, he could see her face change. "Lucas owns this wire," she whispered. "I just sold it to him," he answered. "You sold it to him?" She was choking over the words. "Yes. He gave me a choice. Either sell him the wire or get myself blasted full of holes." Slowly, he told her what had happened. The men drew near and listened to what he was saying. "And you let him get away with it?" Nancy said. "What else could I do?" he questioned. He meant business. "Just because one of his men was holding a gun on you, you let him scare you into selling him wire which you had already sold to you." "I couldn't do anything," Barnett defended. Somehow, he felt like a first-class heel, yet he knew that legally he was completely in the clear. No money had passed between the girl and him. Therefore, no sale had been completed. And actually, Lucas had been the first person to offer to buy the wire. Legally, he was in the clear, but he was having trouble with his conscience. Morally, he had sold the wire to Nancy Jones and the men she represented. Then, under the pressure of a gun, he had backed out. Somehow, this smelled an awful lot like cowardice. "I just couldn't do anything else," Barnett repeated. "They had me." A tall, stooped man detached himself from the group. "Maybe you couldn't do anything," he said. "But I can. Where's Lucas?" "In the back end of the saloon on that side street, the last time I saw him," Barnett answered. "Did he pay you for the wire?" "Yes." "Give me the money he gave you." "Give you? Why?" "Give it to me and don't ask any damned questions," the tall man said. Barnett silently passed the money to him. "No," Nancy suddenly said. "Dad. No. You won't have a chance. You can't do it." "Shut up, Nancy. I'm handling this." The girl was silent, but she looked like she was suddenly too scared to breathe. The tall, stooped man slipped the package of bills into his pocket. In the growing light of dawn, he started walking down the street. A heavy pistol hung low in the holster at his hip. They watched him start to go around the corner toward the back door of the saloon. Lucas and his 2 killers were just coming out of the back door of the saloon. The guns started instantly. Barnett saw the stooped man reach for the pistol in his holster. He was an old man, and he moved slowly. An eternity seemed to pass while he was trying to get the gun out of its holster. A bullet knocked him down before he could pull the gun. He fell heavily, lifted himself on his left hand, and still tried to pull his gun. Bullets kicked up puffs of dust around him. He got the gun out of the holster, lifted it in a trembling, unsteady hand. It boomed once. Then a bullet knocked off half the top of his head. The gun stopped. The stooped man lay in the dusty street without moving. Barnett heard Nancy begin to cry. Then she was running toward the still figure lying in the street. He ran beside her. She dropped to her knees, tried to pull her father's head into her lap. Blood stained her hands and her skirt. Tears too hard to cry glistened in her eyes. Barnett stood over her. A pistol fell out of his pocket. She stared at the gun. "Did you have that all the time?" He nodded. "I had forgotten I had it," he stammered. He was telling the truth. From the moment when the pistol was jammed into his back until he stood over Nancy, he had completely forgotten about the gun he was carrying. He was not accustomed to thinking in terms of weapons. The world where he had lived all his life was raw and rough and full of scramble and fight, but men in his line did not settle their differences with guns. Kit Barnett did not think in terms of weapons. He had completely forgotten the gun he was carrying. Out here in this raw Western country, they still thought of guns. "You rotten coward," Nancy whispered. How could he explain? Down the side street by the door of the saloon, a man was lying on the ground. One of Lucas's gunmen. The fallen man had made good on one of his shots. Bart Lucas and his remaining killer were bending over the man on the ground. Then they were standing up. They still had guns in their hands. Barnett picked up his gun. He started toward them. They saw the gun in his hands. They saw him coming. "Get that son of a gun," Lucas yelled. Their guns came up. Bullets tore holes in the air around Barnett. He lifted the gun he was carrying. The dawn light was stronger now. It was strong enough for him to see Lucas over the sights of his gun. The arrogance on Lucas's face was gone. It had been replaced by a startled fear when he saw this drummer coming toward him with a gun. Barnett pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. He thought all he had to do to fire the gun was to pull the trigger. Vaguely, he had the impression that pulling the trigger was all that was necessary. This had been true of the only pistol he had ever fired. He thought the gun he had was a double-action pistol. Instead, it was a single-action gun, an old model, deadly in the hands of a man who knew how to use it, but not like the only pistol he had ever fired. He pulled the trigger again. And nothing happened. A bullet from Lucas's gun passed so close to his head that he could feel the movement of the air. He realized then that the gun he had in his hands had to be cocked before it would fire. He pulled the hammer back. Behind him, a gun was exploding. Bullets were coming past him from behind. Back there on the ground, he knew that Nancy was shooting. He saw Lucas hastily take a snapshot at her. He lined up the sights of his gun again. The heavy pistol jumped in his hands as he pulled the trigger. An expert gunslinger would have emptied the gun in the time Barnett took to fire one shot. The very speed with which the gunman fired the weapon might have ruined his aim and made the bullets miss. Kit didn't know the one fact that all the gunmen knew. You had to shoot fast, or you might never shoot at all. He thought you were supposed to aim before you fired. He aimed his shot. The very fact that he stood there facing them disturbed Bart Lucas and his gunmen. The fact that the girl was also shooting at them distracted their aim. Otherwise, Kit would never have lived long enough to fire even one shot. They would have mowed him down, filled him with lead, before he learned how to fire the gun. His aim shot hit Lucas squarely in the left chest. It knocked all the arrogance out of him forever. Barnett was aware that there were two figures sprawled in the side street, and that a third man was running like the very devil in the opposite direction. He felt dazed, and there was a dreamlike quality about everything. There was a haze in his mind. He felt somebody tugging at his arm. He looked around. Nancy was standing beside him. "Kit," she was whispering, "did you ever shoot a gun before?" He looked at the pistol in his hand and shook his head. "I never shot a gun like this in all my life," he answered slowly. He saw she was crying and wondered why. "When I saw you trying to shoot, I realized you didn't know anything about guns," she was saying. "And I'm so very, very sorry I called you a coward." He patted her shoulder. "That's all right," he said. "I am a coward. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to run. And right now, I'm scared clear down to the bottom of the shoes." "So am I," she whispered. "So am I." Her words faltered, and he saw the gray pallor begin to creep over her face. "I feel like fainting," she whispered. "Go ahead," he answered. He caught her as she sagged down, then picked her up and carried her around the corner to where a group of awed men were coming toward them. Lucas's men were already slipping quietly away. When their leader died, their fight had ended. The men coming toward Barnett were Nancy's friends. There was a new light in the eyes of these men, a respectful light. "Is she hurt?" one asked. "Are you all right?" a second questioned. "Let us help you," a third said. "We're both all right," he answered. "I'm taking her down to Ma Pearson's rooming house, so Ma can take care of her for a while. And when you get this side street cleaned up, you can start moving that barbed wire out to Silver Springs." He walked on. The full light of dawn was on the world. People, roused by the roar of gunfire, looked out of the windows at them. She lay easily in his arms. Somehow, she was the lightest burden he had ever carried. Around Sweet Home, they still tell the story of how the drummer selling barbed wire blew in from Chicago and landed right in the middle of a fight. And they tell how he took a pistol he did not know how to use and went in and faced Lucas and a gunman who had cut their teeth on guns, how he gambled his life, and how he won. They call this sort of thing courage around Sweet Home. Do you like wild Western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 wild Western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today. The end.